all of this year's talks are about cosmogony and cosmology. That is all the philosophical talks. Next week we'll be finishing up the geometry section in the astrology. Cosmo, meaning organization. Genie, which our word generation or genius comes from, meaning birth or creation. So this is, cosmogony means the birth of the cosmos. And we're going to be talking about what is involved in the birth of the cosmos. Cosmology is the method or the system or the order of the cosmos. We'll be taking the two side by side, and we'll be taking principles that come out of them. I'm going to try and keep the talk shorter than normal, even less than 90 minutes if I can, for several reasons. Because for the most part they deal with very, very deep topics. And it's hard to spend a lot of time in deep things and hold the attention. I'm not sure that I can do that very well. It gets cloying very quickly. A second reason is that much of it is outside of the realm of our everyday experience, and even if we're trying to look at the spiritual creation in terms of everyday life and everyday experience, it's still a lot of it out of what we experience every day, and talking about foreign things all the time is also not a pleasant thing to do. And on top of that, I am not well developed in my inwardness so that I can give a full-blown presentation of the creation. All of this is living material. This is the series of talks that's ongoing for, it's been running 1 year. It'll probably run another year after this, is Mystery, Wisdom, and Modern Thought. And in the mystery schools, especially in the Western mystery schools, when one is initiated, that is, when one begins with full consciousness to see the spiritual worlds and unfold their divine capabilities within, they relive out of the memory of nature, they relive the whole cosmic creation. And then in that reliving, they see the part that they had in creation. Obviously, I'm not an initiate. I'm just a beginner, and will not be able to be really full about it. Chalk dust. The method of developing this is very similar to what we do in that introductory astrology class, where we take an idea and run it through all of the signs of the zodiac, except in this class it's going to be reliving all of the stages, and this is a cosmological morphology, and we'll see how the cosmos changes within itself in one form, resolves out of another, and out of another, and the only way that can be done is by reliving it. So I'm going to try and do as much as I can, do the whole course in the spirit of storytelling, like we started out 2 weeks ago when we began this. I'm going to begin by skipping material. I'm going to start with personal experience so that you can understand how this came about, at least in my consciousness. Is there something that's producing an echo? I hear a whisper-like echo. Is that? Now it's gone. Maybe I'm hearing it over your earphones. Just what he wanted on the tape. Okay. This is going to be really professional tapes. He likes doing things professionally, and I love doing things like an amateur. And so we have the two different outlooks. In my early manhood, I was very philosophically inclined. And I was sort of like a spanky or a naughty little Socrates, going around asking impossible questions. I asked, why does everything exist? What is the purpose of the cosmos? And I went to different people and I got different non-answers. I went to my church and they said, have a cookie. And I went to philosophy classes, and they gave me the Boolean structure of why nothing exists. And I went to the counterculture. Instead of giving me a cookie, they gave me marijuana. And because I was very egocentric, nobody had any answers. I had a few friends that had answers because they had intuitions. And in those intuitions, things were live. But basically, I began, instead of asking the question, why do things exist? I began asking, do things exist? And I became very, very pessimistic. And finally I came to the conclusion that there can be no God, because surely I'd know about God if there were, because I thought I was the be-all, end-all, and that I knew everything. And therefore, God must not exist. I didn't have any answers as to why what was here was here. I hadn't been indulged in existentialism or anything like that. I was thoroughly negative. I knew what didn't exist, but I had no answers for what did exist. And then I became extremely negative and dissolute and self-doubting and everything else. But I never quit asking those questions. And eventually I asked those questions. Gee, it feels like I have a lisp. I kept asking those questions until at one time I had a mystical experience. I saw a light, and using the word saw isn't quite right because it's not clear whether I saw it with an inner eye or an outer eye or both. And my life was very much transformed. But that wasn't the good part. It was wonderful, and I was in tears for months afterwards. But the really good part was that as time went on, something grew in me as I grew in it. And I developed the beginnings of an inward life. And needless to say, the experience was quite humilifying, which was one of the most wonderful things because that broke open my, at least for a moment, my hard shell of egoism, and I could be enriched inwardly by a new flow of life because I wasn't shutting it off for myself alone. And as I continued to ponder the big questions like why does it all exist? Why are we here? Because I was more open, gradually answers began to grow in me. And I have also done a lot of studying on metaphysics and the metaphysics of cosmology and cosmology, especially from the mystery schools. And the studying put together with my inward experience, it sort of guided my intuition, and I became to know things much, much better. And one of the things that I noted is that what happened to me was not singular. In fact, it is a general case that if you look in the history of philosophy, especially the Western versions, Schopenhauer being a perfectly good example, that the more one contemplates the absolute and becomes preoccupied with the absolute, the more likely they are to become insane or melancholy or lost in absurdities. So there's something about it that one must always approach the absolute, but there is sort of a healthy proportion that if you keep asking the biggest whys all the time, it takes you so far away from experience, the experience of life, that it messes your entire life up and messes up your entire consciousness. On the other hand, if you never elevate yourself out of the husks of matter, you fall asleep. You fall asleep in sensualistic kind of experience, and you just don't wake up anymore. This whole talk is going to be basically about waking up. It should be a very sunrise talk, an early in the morning sort of talk. And so, what happened within myself, and I guess it's what happened with everyone that is attempted to follow a mystical, an inward path, is that I began to see. Now that doesn't mean that I'm clairvoyant or that I'm a seer or anything like that, but even those words are not binary words, off or on. Those are intensive words, so such that one sees more all of the time until one's inward seeing is such that even the most subtle nature of our existence becomes palpable to the inner vision. So like it isn't like one day you're going to be non-clairvoyant and the next day you're going to be clairvoyant. It's something that little bit by little bit you awaken. And this seeing about the nature of reality or ultimate reality is not quite like looking with our physical eyes. I like the way Meister Eckhart said it he said it the most clear. He said one does not see God with the same eyes that one sees a cow. It's with a much different kind of vision. It's with a spiritual kind of vision. And it's a spiritual vision that you must put your life into your seeing. And it becomes a living truth. No one can have a visionary consciousness without living a spiritual life. You can have psychic clairvoyance, but anybody can have that. They can teach you that in the weekend for $80 or $100 or something like that. I don't want to. This is too holy material to mix up with sardony, so I'll just pass on a lot of that. So we'll work slowly. It's not going to be a long talk, but I'm going to work at it slowly, though it may sound like in-choate madness, or it may sound like yammerings or the tale told of an idiot, because it's something that's the hardest thing to talk about. But being psychologically temerarious, I'll take a shot at it. It's something I love very much, is talking about the relationship to the absolute. I should mention that what we're talking about when we're talking about the absolute, we're talking about something that is exceedingly difficult to even address indirectly. Because the absolute is operative at every level of existence and non-existence. So as I talk, it's going to sound sort of like philosophical small talk, because my words are not the words of power that create the cosmos. And what we're talking about is the beginning and the continued beginning of all being. And it is absolute in the most magnum sense of the word. But speaking this way about it is going to seem like the most minimum sense of the word. So if you ask yourself a question, what is absolute truth? That question cannot be answered. It cannot be answered fully. Because from a manifest sense, absolute truth is infinite. And therefore the answer would have to be infinite. You can't have a small, limited answer to an infinite question. I realize some of these talks sound like they're infinite. But that's not quite the case. But the absolute truth must also define the absolute untruth. And so when some people were strained in their patience waiting for this to begin, they thought this was some kind of cone that one sat and looked at for a long enough time until they experienced it. They weren't so far from wrong. If we say something, if we give an answer about what is the absolute truth, that will be true. But it'll only be partial. And if it's partial, it can't be absolute. And that leads to a paradox. So that it seems almost foolish to try to talk about something absolute, because every attempt shows your limitations or it shows your weakness. And in this paradox, if you keep on trying and talking infinitely, you elaborate more and more and more of what you know and what is truth. But then the bigger the unbeing, the untruth, the non-truth is. And so like the paradox just carries on infinitely with you, and this really can't be answered. And so we can see how madness develops. But also the whole of our understanding develops out of this. Because once we know we exist, and we have the experience of self-consciousness or waking consciousness and then lose it partially, we begin to wonder, what is that? What is our basic nature? So we've been talking about unanswerable questions in the other course, in the astrology course, which we'll go back to next week. We've been talking about mathematical problems that can't be solved. But in trying to solve all of these mathematical problems, all of what we know as mathematics now has been developed. And the same is true of spiritual philosophy, that even though no one has ever written a definitive answer about what is the absolute truth and what is the nature of the ultimate being, no one has ever done that. Everything that we know that furthers our inward development and how to get to a realization of some of these spiritual things have come out of it. And so we have some wonderful, wonderful metaphysics. In the East, when it comes to ultimates, there are two schools that flow together. There's the Sankhya school, and the most beautiful, some of this is going to sound like a little later on, the Vedantin school. The Vedantins have a very, very exquisite and entailed metaphysics that deals with all sorts of subtle creations, all sorts of subtle differentiations within the creative process. But all of the mystery schools, like in modern times, you can find excellent renditions, like, for example, in the Theosophist, most notably Madame Blavatsky. You can find some interesting things in Alice Bailey. But most of this will have been influenced by Western thought in terms of the expressions like that of Rudolf Steiner or of the Rosicrucians. And that's the outlook, so that even though there can't be an ultimate answer, the answers that we do have that lead us to experience come out of trying to answer something that can't be answered. Now, there is a choice that most people who seem to have attained to spirituality, and I say who seem to, it's a matter of, we can't say that for sure, because with regard to true spirituality, most of us are in the same position as a fish in a pool room. There are fishes and there are sharks, and the fish never really understands that the shark is a better player. And the fish thinks every time, geez, if that ball had gone a little bit better, or if he hadn't gotten so lucky, I would have won that game. And with the lesser consciousness trying to understand the greater consciousness, it's not a very easy thing to do, and that's the position that we're in. But relative to those people who are sages and those people who have knowledge, the absolute has been given two symbols. One is like this wall. It's like this wall with no lights. It is blackness. There is nothing to see, nothing to be seen, or nothing that one looks for. And the other is silence. We probably shouldn't even do these talks if we were really in the know. We would remain in silence, but that wouldn't be very helpful, or that wouldn't be very enlightening to anyone either. There are intermediary symbols. The most common intermediary symbol for the absolute is the circle. However, it's not this circle. It's not this one. It is a circle where the radius is all radii and the locus is all loci. That is, it could be anywhere or it could be anywhere. This also happens to be the symbol of the most universal state of spirit. So this is where spirit fuses into the unspeakable we're calling absolute. We can't even call it the absolute, because if we give it an article that gives it a manifest, substantial existence, and you can't do that. You know what I'm trying to say? I can't even say it is. It is all that you can do. With regard This can be seen as the field of spiritual focus. One can expand one's attention to infinity, or one can concentrate one's attention to a point. And in the most condensed kind of experience versus the most attenuated or empty experience, one senses equally the quality of absolute. Now, all of that is really beating around the bush, and it's very unsatisfactory. The relationship of our consciousness, because I'm assuming all of us walked in here intending to walk in, and everybody will leave intending to never walk in again. But that we're somewhat awake, and that we can think, and thinking is forming our thoughts around intuitions, and those intuitions are the truth. And so we're awake. And the harder we think, and the livelier our intuitions are within the thoughts, that is what our existence is like, whether we're awake or not. And all of this talk about something we can't talk about is not very satisfying. So in casting around for words in human experience that give us some sort of a liaison of our waking consciousness to absolute, there's only one word that makes any sense to me, and that has the degree of elusiveness and universality plus that makes any sense to use in this context. It's a word that we use every day in many ways. Consciousness. You see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to, in my own experience, live a truth and share that as you are living it, how our waking state of being partakes of and is within absolute. And that is through the vehicle of consciousness. Now there are many, if you look in the dictionary, there are many words that are used for consciousness. There's unconsciousness, there's pre-consciousness, there's waking consciousness, there's trance consciousness, there's pre-consciousness, many different kinds. But we're talking about the one property that is common to all of them. Even in unconsciousness, that's really a bad word, even in unconsciousness, it is implied that waking consciousness can come to pass out of it. And there is something of our waking state that trails off back into unconsciousness. I don't know how to say that, but I think everybody has had that experience. I try to do a lot of different types of inward exercises. And when you're most successful, you usually fall asleep. You know what I'm saying? That when your consciousness, you strive, the intent of all exercises is to become more awake, to become more aware, to become more alive, to expand our consciousness. But when we expand into something that's so rare, it seems like we just drift off into unconsciousness. That is, for us, on our lowly human level, there is a low threshold to the absolute. I don't know how to say it any other way but we fall asleep. Now, we're talking about the entire cosmic creation. And creation is an attribute of being in consciousness. There isn't any such a thing as a non-creative spiritual manifestation. There isn't any such a thing as a non-creative universe that's just sort of spinning around. This is like thinking about it like the physicists do. There isn't any such a thing that it's just like a big machine running out. You know, like there are wheels turning here and there. There isn't such a thing. Everything is always being created. It's always being renewed. This is as above, so below. This is a creative experience. One thing I want to talk about, I want to mention right away, and it's one of the most important things we're going to talk about all night, and that is the unity of consciousness lives on every level. And that unity is maintained no matter what the internal differentiations within spirit matter may be. It is said in the mystery schools as the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven shall follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. Or, the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven. That is to say, what we're talking about, we can experience it in a little way in our daily life, and we can carry that all the way back into the most exalted state of creation, because unity is never lost. I guess what I'm trying to talk about is creation in relation to waking consciousness. We're talking about the absolute that has trailing through it consciousness. And the answer that we can give to what is the absolute truth is what we have waking consciousness of. And the relationship of the waking consciousness to the unknown, to the unconscious, to the absolute, is the relationship of creation. This is not talking about a creation with a beginning and an end. This is talking about a creation that goes on. That is to say that we awaken by creating. It's not clear, I think both are true actually, it's not clear whether the unknown or the unconscious draws us on with mystery into it, or whether we, in our desire for more consciousness, project ourselves creatively into the unconscious. It's probably both. If you happen to have a more masculine consciousness, you would think the latter. If you have a more feminine consciousness, you would probably think the former. Doesn't make any difference whether you're in a male or female body. The next life you'll probably be in the other anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. Now there's a peculiar thing about this, that we come to waking consciousness through creation. We might say that a creation is the means of becoming. But the creations are most likely illusions. It's absurdity, but it's so. This is sort of like saying, it's like ifing, it's like dreaming. saying, if this is so, then this would be so. And by making believe that something is so, the experience of the interface with ignorance through the creative dream results in a greater waking consciousness, a greater becoming. It doesn't make any difference that the creative dream is illusory. The waking consciousness that is born of it is real. You know what I'm trying to say? It's very much like going through an experience. We go through this all the time in life. We find ourselves in the middle of some kind of dilemma. And in this dilemma, we're struggling with something. And after we've struggled long enough, we come to an awareness. The struggle may persist, or the condition may persist, or it may go away, and that doesn't make any difference. What we know doesn't go away. It's real. And that reality, it doesn't make any difference that there's a non-reality. If you live through fully in your application of attention, any reality, any non-reality, there will be a reality of greater consciousness that comes out of it. It's like saying that sincerity of application of attention to an if, or to an experiment, or to a dream is what results as waking consciousness. I don't know the why for that. I'll be very honest, and I'll give you... I don't know why it is that the greatest truth that we can know is born of what is illusion being treated as real. I don't know that. It sounds awfully difficult, but it works. If there's an example that I use for it many times over, it's like an artwork. And in your inner consciousness, you can see an artwork. And then you go through the process of trying to make it become. And it never is like you saw it inwardly. You can make something beautiful, you can pour a lot of the Spirit into it, and it can be wonderful, but it never is as you saw it inwardly. But after you've created it, the dream is reborn. The creative conception is reborn in a way that is more beautiful than it was before you tried to do the artwork. In fact, if you only dream and never live out your dreams, you just sort of puddle away in your consciousness. It becomes a pot smoker's reality, where people like to talk about the things they're going to do and never actually do them. And that, it is in living out the lie, as it is called. I have a very delightful friend in town that loves to talk about these subjects, and he calls it living out the lie. He's one of the better theosophists in the country as far as theosophical thought. His name is Richard Isle. Sometime you can engage him in a talk about living out the lie. I think you'll find it very, very enjoyable. I'm going to skip some things again. Now, the words that we're using sound very much like words that are used by psychologists, such as Freud and Jung and Adler and people like that. And when we're talking about the relationship of consciousness to unconsciousness, we're not talking about precisely the same thing as Jung, for example. We're talking, when Jung is speaking, he's speaking very specifically about a personal subconscious or unconscious that is connected to a universal unconscious, but in terms of mystery wisdom, in terms of the spiritual reality of the cosmos, that is not what we're talking about. That is a much smaller subset to what we're trying to deal with the creation of the whole cosmos. But the beauty of it is that the parallels between the beginning of the cosmic creation and what takes place in terms of soul growth and waking up within ourselves in a psychological growth and struggle, the parallels follow very closely. It's again the same thing that unity carries through. Now, the waking consciousness, since it relates to the absolute and is, you might say, a precipitation or condensation of all consciousness, if you like, or all unconsciousness would probably be better, it has to be one. It is a matter of oneness. Universe means one. It can't be any other way. It's a logical impossibility. And this oneness has a character. And that character has been given various different mythological symbols. And one of them, in relating to the character of how the conscious expands itself through the creative dream into the unconscious, that has been given the symbol always of a tree. And it is very much like that if we consider the earth, the unknown, and the tree that lives in the light, the world tree, the world ash, which in Norse mythology was called Yggdrasil. The reaching out into the unknown is like the roots unconsciously ramifying, dividing, crawling, creeping into the earth and drawing out the knowledge or the essence, the things that it needs for its continued life, for its continued growth, for its fruiting. All of those things, that is like the symbol that has been most universal for the relationship of consciousness, waking consciousness, to all unconsciousness. The universal oneness, the character of waking consciousness, which has as its chief attribute being and its chief activity creation, that has been called in mystery literature the Supreme Being. Probably for where we're at right now, it might be better to talk about it as the Supreme Venus, because the ness form is much better for talking about universals. This tends to put it in terms of something like a human being, and it tends to have that limitation. Now, indeed, there is a limitation, because right now there is only so much waking consciousness. There's an unlimited potential between the waking consciousness and the absolute. There's an unlimited potential. But in terms of manifest beingness, there is a limitation. And as above, so below, or as below, so above, in the same way that our attention is leading us to greater growing consciousness, the same is happening within the Supreme in a regular, rhythmic, breathing fashion in relation to the Absolute. That even what we call the Supreme, the ultimate, is itself relative, but not relative in the sense of partial in being unknowing, because the knowing has the quality of consciousness within the Absolute, such that it is everywhere in the Absolute, even though the whole Absolute isn't awakened. But you can even talk about the whole Absolute. You know what I'm trying to say? It isn't partial that it's like you look at the world and there's this hunk is completed and this hunk over here is not completed. It's not like that. It's universal, but I don't know how it is with you, but for me, I don't like the statement that there's nothing new under the sun. I don't like that statement at all. But I do think there are new things under the sun all the time, and that every day is a brand new day and it's all created. But I find that there are many themes that keep coming back in my life that sort of form the skeleton of reality, and the spiritual life is not like a train going off into new revelations all the time, though it is constantly expanding into new things. But the greater part is that the things of every day in our consciousness, again the word consciousness, become richer. And there's more light there, and everything is more full. And that spiritual growth is not a matter of thinking of constantly expanding ourselves like some great big gas balloon, but it's a matter of having greater and greater wakingness and greater creativity. Because the creativity, we are creating ourselves, and we are creating the cosmos in ourselves in this very process. Okay, I don't want to get too far off from my notes. Okay, I've sort of jumped over my notes a little bit. So we have supreme beingness. And one of the very limited images that we've used is like a tree with its roots going into the dark unknown. And so this interaction between the waking consciousness and the unknown is called the pole of creation. Because like a tree, there is the stem and there is the pole. And part of the pole that is like the part that is above the earth is called spirit. And spirit becomes, and spirit knows itself, and spirit wakes up over time. Time as seen from the viewpoint of the active consciousness. Time that is before experience and then the conscious waking to something that we carry with us after experience. That is the potential there is time. Whereas the ignorance, the application of the attention of spiritual spirit into ignorance is a condensation of the known reflected in the ignorance, and the ignorance then, the reflection in ignorance is called matter. If you like the Oriental terms, the spirit that is all-knowing is called Purusha, and the matter is called Prakriti. 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 Trying to put an extra R in there. I must have a lot of egoism in this whole talk. And matter then, or the illusory forms that are condensations of ignorance that are a waking of consciousness in the all unconscious of the Absolute, then the Absolute in that regard as potential, which is that ifing state, that dream state between the Absolute and conscious being, that is called space. And the whole process of things passing from spirit projecting itself into matter, and matter being drawn out as soul into spirit, that whole process is the beginning or the awakening or the creating of consciousness. So we have three things taking place. We have spirit in the potential of time, and matter in the potential of space, and we have consciousness becoming. This is an irreversible process, you realize. This takes place all the time, every day. That once you know something, you can't unknow it. Whether it is if you discover that somebody that you have trusted is a cheat, and you didn't, you don't want to know those things, but when you know them, you can't unknow them. Or when you discover something beautiful like music, or you discover a truth, it is irreversible. It cannot go back into an unconsciousness. It can't go back into the unknown. It can't go back into the unconscious. The upshot of this is that there is a perpetual wakingness. And there's sort of a valve in creation. And that is ever becoming. And you realize that I'm trying to bring out some of the corollaries that apply to everyday life. That we don't have to worry about, once we've awakened something in ourselves, about losing it. It's there. When we once have a true realization of something, we're not going to lose it, especially the more ultimately spiritual it is and the greater that reality. Also, since we do have these roots, and consciousness with a capital C pervades both waking consciousness and absolute unconsciousness, or all unconsciousness within the absolute would be a better way of saying it, that means that there is nothing that we cannot learn. There's nothing that we cannot learn. So I don't believe this stuff about IQ tests. That they say you're limited to, that you can only learn this much or that much. It's true that some people have a lot of limitations that they've given themselves. But I think once a person has waked up just a little bit to themselves, and once they've waked up just a little bit to the possibility of unfolding greater consciousness, there is nothing we can't know, and nothing we can't do. It strikes me that the same people that say that you have only so much IQ claim that Goethe had the highest IQ known to any human being. And Goethe got it all through meditation and said as much. You know what I'm trying to say? That these are some of the corollaries. This is getting a little bit longer than I intended it to be. And boy, there's just so much that we could talk about in here. So ever much, but I'm going to keep the next one shorter than this. So, yeah, that's true. What are we at? We're at only about 60 minutes. Oh.
Are you on the
Yeah. No matter what, I'm in trouble on the level or off balance. Obviously, the zero, which is no number from which all number comes. One represents the supreme. There is only one one. There is no other one. And the whole process of the pole dividing itself, going with its roots into unconsciousness for new fertile material, and spreading out into new light and blossoming forth with new fruit, that is a process of a division, an internal division into two. This comes back to some of the geometric material or some of the number theory we've been talking about in the astrology class. So there is that polarization between the unknown, the known within the unknown. There is that polarization. And that results in something, if we look in the potential of time, which is the spiritual potential as opposed to the material potential. If we look in there and we come to a realization, whether it's in our daily life or whether it is the Supreme Being saying to be or not to be, at the very beginning of the whole new beginning cycle, on any level, there is something where we can say that there was, oh boy, how is it? At any time we can say that something is. But that state of existence that something is a consequence of something that was. Even though it was illusory and this relationship was illusory, what is a consequence of what was. And what we're talking about when we're talking about the ifing, we're talking about the cosmic dream. We all live in the cosmic dream of the Supreme Being. That whole dream, that whole make-believe could be. Does this harken back to, you remember all those stories about the old hags, Ud, Skuld, and Verdandi, past, the present, and the future, that they weave out the destiny of all of the entire cosmos. And they're right at that edge of being as a creative action, the application of attention. So this is and was is saying that the whole process of being, the whole process of creation, is a threefold process. And what we're talking about is, in another way, some of the same things we've been talking about in the astrology classes. This is Trinitarian or attributive thought. This is a becoming. This is the three states within the one. So we have memory, and we have waking, and we have dreaming or experimenting. All of those take part in the process of being. Or we can say the known, the unknown, and the expanding. They don't fit quite this way, though. We have the known being the present, the unknown being, this is and the unknown. All of those are attributes of the process. You understand what I'm trying to get at in this? I'm trying to be ultimately practical. That I'm looking at this as the most universal thing of all people that I consider bona fide seers. Some that are questionable. If we take G.I. Gurdjieff, or if we take Krishnamurti, if we take Rudolf Steiner, or if we take C.W. Ledbetter. All of them have as the most universal exercise for becoming a seer. That is someone who is awake of self on every level of existence, trying to go all the way back to the connection with the Absolute, which all of us have. In that regard, we are and are equal to the Supreme Being in the ability to do something completely new. And that is a process, the one universal exercise. I think Gurdjieff and Ouspensky call it self-remembering. Krishnamurti calls it paying attention. Max Heindel calls it concentration. What did Rudolf Steiner call it? I don't know. Some people call it self-watching. But it's most universal. That is being in the now. That is being conscious. And what I'm doing is I'm just rehearsing something that we've all known before, and it's an experience that we've all gone through before, and I'm trying to relate it to how the entire cosmos begins, how it comes into existence. Now, obviously, now we're going to go into cosmogony, even cosmography, a little bit for a second. If we have these three states of being, there are different ways of looking at them. I'm greedy and I want to look at all of them, but I don't want to stay over 90 minutes. In fact, in relation to the Supreme Being, the top of the triangle is always open. And the top of the triangle in the Supreme Being leads out into the Absolute, into the unknown. The second attribute, see, the Absolute, if it is leading us on from the feminine point of view, the quality within the Supreme that leads into that is a reflection of the Absolute, is the imagination. But the consciousness and character of the imagination, which is light and amorphous morphability, that is formless formability, is it's a manifest character that is a reflection of what the Absolute is in its unconsciousness in relation to consciousness. And that is that ifness. The character of the highest attribute is much more staunch. It's much more isness. It's almost like static, because the Absolute, relative to the dynamism of becoming, the Absolute is static, or it has that quality of potential. And so then the Absolute wills the imagination, or the imagination draws out the Supreme Being in the creativity, and it results in an active experience. And once there is that active experience, when something goes from was to is, it is then becomes self-conscious. Now there are many, many ways that we can look at that. So we have this trinity of things. If we put this triangle on the pole, the great cosmic tree, we can reflect another triangle. Because if we look from a different point of view, if we look not from the point of view of consciousness becoming, where the absolute seems all subtle, and we have this attenuated consciousness like we fall asleep in our meditations, and it attenuates into unconsciousness. Instead of looking at it that way, if we look as a statement of being, a statement of isness, like a statement of beingness knowing itself and saying, I am, that then is where the absolute, instead of seeming like that thin silence, it becomes like the thick blackness. And it becomes a contrast. It's a dark, heavy shadow. It's like the earth that the roots go into. And matter becomes condensed according to the projection of selfness of the Supreme into the unknown. And then we have a projection or a reflection of the threefold spirit being reflected in threefold matter. But always in all of this, there is the center of attention. Does everybody understand what I'm trying to say? That in one way, the world is a mirror of ourself. In another way, the world is a product of a very subtle dream, turning inward, back inward, or whether we turn outward, it results in either a reflective, resistive triangle, or it results in a shadowy kind of triangle that edges back off into the unknown. And in all of these, there is always the focus of attention, which is again the circle, or the circle as a point. So this is where we have the basis of the mystical seven, that everything in the cosmic creation is based on the seven of manifestation. 3 above, 3 below, and the center of being. But in the same way that there is this cycle of was, is, and is becoming through the process of could be, there is a cycle of the known and the unknown. There is an oscillation of the center of attention between the reflective external and the attenuated internal. And so the 3 is associated, either the center of attention is associated with either the external or the internal, until as we approach the end of a cosmos, they both collapse into each other and they're both seen simultaneously, which is a process of soul growth that we're going to talk about much, much further on down the line. But there's a lot of other things that are much more down to earth than all of this. So what I'm saying is that the center of attention being placed as it is now with the reflective triangle, it becomes the square. It becomes the fourth leg of the square, and we have the house, you might say, the temple being the 4 planes of matter with the focus of attention being one versus the threefold spirit. There are lots that would be lovely if we could have visuals where we could project 3 beams of light and have them overlap and then produce the secondary colors, and then in the center the one color that is the combination of all of them, the 7th, the indigo, the center, which again relates to the absolute. There are a lot of beautiful things that you can do like that. Maybe someday we'll get a chance to have them all outright, where where there are visible representations. Now, within the Supreme, the ultimate being, the quality of beingness that accomplishes everything because it already is power. The quality that ifs or dreams or imagines or takes invisible power of knowing and turns it into light is called Word. And the conscious changing process where it becomes actualized is associated with motion. So in the beginning was the Word. And the beginning is not supposed to be thought of like sunrise, exactly, where the day begins at that moment. The beginning is an ongoing verb. In the beginning. And the beginning, you might say, is as good a term in the Bible as any for the absolute. In the beginning, which is like a process of becoming, was the Word. And the Word was with the power. And the Word was the power. You could as easily say in the beginning was the imagination. And the imagination was with the power. And the imagination was the power. All things were made by it, and without it was not anything made that was made. In it was life. This is again this breathing. This is like an instilling of life by breathing. And the life was the light of enlightened ones. And the light shined in darkness, and the darkness graspeth it not. Didn't change the absolute one bit, except that the absolute is still absolute, except that there is more becoming. This is something I do every day. I never miss a day where my first thought, if I can possibly help it, is not trying to go back to the very original, ongoing creation in the beginning. There are times that much more waking effort is put into in the beginning, is put into listening to the Word, which is both a fiat and a laugh and a cry, and it has the character of everything that brings about waking consciousness. But listening for the Word is probably one of the most important exercises that we can do. Yes, I believe the Word is in the Bible, but the Word is in everything else. The living Word is what we're talking about, that resides in us. So this is what we're talking about. This is much different. This is what the cosmologists in the physics astronomy sense would call the Big Bang. It's a creative fiat. This is the statement of the Word. Looking at it, this is the meaning. Or another word that I like a lot, and I think Don Juan used a very good word, or Carlos Castaneda did, with the word intention. This is the intention that is meant in speaking the Word. The intent to know something. The intent to become. And this is obviously when it becomes a realization, when it becomes a known character, then it becomes a name. So we have a meaning, an intention, or a definition is related with the first attribute. And when that meaning becomes manifest in the dream or in the imagination, it becomes the Word. And when it becomes known and it has the stamp of character by being actualized, you might even say the hallmark of the divine, it becomes the name. Now, again, when this is reflected into matter, the absolute becomes like all space. But that's much too dense for us to understand. To try and take off too big of a bite of the absolute. You know, the absolute is like mathematical space, where there are points that have nothing but position, and they're contiguous and infinite. That is completely solid with points. A basic state of defining a number of those points according to the intention of self-becoming, an inner self-knowing of the degree of intention, the defining of them is the definition of atoms of cosmic root substance. These are words that are used by the mysteries, ancient and modern, Eastern. See, our root comes back to us, our definition comes back to us, and substance comes back to us according to intention. These atoms are defined within the intention of the Supreme. And then the word is spoken. And the word is spoken in that inclines the various atoms almost like various tops. And then comes the motion and everything is set spinning. This is what is claimed by all initiates of all schools that have ever been able to reach deeply enough into the Supreme. And the 7 qualities of being, including focus, matter, and spirit, those 7 qualities of being become 7 states of consciousness, or they become 7 planes of matter. They're called cosmic planes. They're way beyond anything. You know, to talk about what we're talking about, well, we're not talking about God. You realize that. What the consciousness of this chalk is to me, the consciousness of God is to the Supreme. We're talking about something very lofty, something that we really don't have. With the profane lives that we live, in one way we shouldn't even be talking about it, but in another way it's mandatory because that's the only thing that can cleanse us of our profanity. But we're talking about the absolute states of existence. They're called the 7 syllables of the word, or they're called the 7 words, or they're called 7 beings. They're spoken of, they're hinted of briefly in the book of Revelation as the 7 thunders, but that book can be understood on many, many levels because it's also made in the image. And of all of these beings, all of these states of beings, all of this substance is beyond our willpower. And our willpower is, we're talking about, if we look at just the grossest forms are the suns and planets and galaxies. Well, the suns and planets and galaxies are on the lowest condensation, the deepest concentrated ignorance of the lowest of these 7 planes. So we're talking about something that is very, very far above our attention, above our consciousness right now, waking consciousness. In fact, I don't want to talk too much about it because there is that thing that we don't want to go mad and we don't want to dilute it by talking over our head all the time. And so I just want to say that those are all precedent to the state of existence within which all of our entire spiritual creative evolution within what we call God, all of those are before or antecedent or behind all of the highest things that we can realize as human beings and still be human beings. So what we're talking about here is something that we can understand in a most infinitesimal amount from our experience, and we can experience the absolute every time we do something creative, but we're just talking about the background. Now, from here on in, we are going to talk about the being we know. It's also a threefold being that we know by the name in the West, or by the title, God. We're going to be talking about the evolution of our solar system and of us within the solar system especially, and we're going to be talking about it as it has been seen by the mystery students, by seers. And what we're saying, the two most important principles, actually at the end of this I want to take out all of the principles, one, and you apply them to everyday life. There are three principles that are of supreme importance tonight. One is, there is nothing that we cannot know. Number two is, everything that we know is universal and is irreversible, I should say. Everything that we know is irreversible. Once we become something, we can't undo it. And the third is that the process is the same process as that of the cosmos. That through unreality, we learn reality. Because to us, the unconscious, the unknown, appears as unreality. Anybody have any questions about this? I may not be able to answer. But... All right. Yeah, so...
I have a couple that are pretty small questions. When you speak of the absolute, would that be the same as speaking of chaos? Or is that...
No, chaos is on a much lower level, but there are parallels. Yes, chaos is to our... Chaos is still a part of manifestation, but it more approaches in similitude the absolute than it does regular manifestation.
The chaos then would be something that would be, if we were to draw an analogy with the chaos in relation to God, the triune God, as the absolute is in relation to the Supreme.
Yes.
The Trinity of the Supreme Being.
Yes. And there is even a focus in, when you're in a chaotic state, which is a highly creative state, as well as a highly assimilative state, that there is a focus within chaos that is like the focus of the supreme relative to the absolute. Or on a much lower level, when we see something clearly in ourselves, we see it through the absolute, and no one else can see that but us. That's one of the most beautiful things about our self-consciousness. Even though the concept of self is an illusion, there is a reality behind it, that we are an eye of God, and we are an eye of the Supreme Being. I used to have, when I was much too mental about this, I used to have a lot of neurotic things, because every time we enter into prayer, all of our strengths and weaknesses come up at the same time, and I've had my greatest temptations to the most terrible kind of evil side by side with the most holy thoughts I've ever had in my life, in the same moment almost. But when first trying to pray, which is to me, be aware, and lovingly be aware of this whole business. I used to be afraid, well, how am I praying? Am I praying to me, the God, or to I, the God within me? Or am I praying to the God of the solar system? Or am I praying to the Supreme Being? And you can get it. I've known people that have neuroses about this for years. But the thing is when you turn inward and when you focus, when you bow your head and you are looking through a spot, in a sense, that is a focus of the Absolute as it appears in space in our bodies, it doesn't make any difference. It's all lined up. If it is a true prayer, the focus of self as God and the Supreme Being are all as one, lined up. All right, you have another one.
Yeah, it's another one on words, sort of. You chose to speak of that which could become. You used the term dreaming, and I was wondering if you had a specific reason for using that term rather than imagination.
I use both of them.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, imagination in some ways is a controlled process, and in some ways it is a relaxation process. I don't know how to say it, or a release process. I don't know about giving ourselves over and floating within the Absolute. But I use the word dreaming more like in the sense of daydreaming or imagining, like that.
So you're intending at least to be...
I'm trying to use...
Directed and under some...
Yeah, I'm trying to flock words around an idea that there really is no word for. In some of the ancient languages where words still had tone power in them and they were much more abstract, like in Sanskrit, some of those languages there were words to describe something like that. When you get into Vedanta metaphysics, man, there are words that you got to ponder them for. First of all, they're a foreign language, and then you got to learn the sense of that, and then you have to ponder them for a long time to understand that they're pointing at something exact. And what this is, because I'm wordy, it's an attempt to hold my attention on the experience of the reality and as precisely as I can use as many words that may be familiar to people and put the words around it, and through them that can be a vehicle to come to what I'm trying to focus on. Yeah.
Are you saying that there is a reality above God? I mean, that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, if you're talking about the Absolute. Yes.
That's really bizarre. I've never heard that. I mean, I always thought of that word God as being the thing, and now you're saying there is...
But that reality is also a non-reality.
Yeah. I mean, I know these are just kind of words, but that whole concept is really interesting to me. Because I've never... it makes me hopeful.
Yes.
Like I can... Because God has always been a stumbling block. Now I can feel something more than that.
Yes.
Or greater than that.
Yes.
Can you say a few more things about that?
Huh?
Great line.
Are you going to talk more about that next time?
No, I'm going to talk next time about the germination of the solar system and the part of God, the Spirit within it, and it will... This is as much as I care to talk about this. I could talk a whole series of talks about it, but by the time it got done, I would be talking to the camera, which is the last thing I want to do. Dale probably wouldn't even be here. He'd probably put it on automatic pilot. And yes.
Yes, I've heard the absolute infinite being referred to not only as blackness and silence, but also light beyond the whitest light.
That's usually the Supreme that is described that way.
And I noticed that you described the absolute as blackness and silence as darkness and light.
Yeah, but the darkness and light are the relationship of the Supreme to the Absolute. But it's not a struggle, though some people have seen the absolute manifest as matter and ignorance, they have seen the struggle of the light of spiritual intelligence with the absolute manifest, or symbolized in that way in matter, as a struggle of good and evil. And unfortunately, because the absolute in this outlook is feminine, being associated with the circle and being associated with the deepest of matter, earth in this case, it's been seen as, this is mostly a Persian outlook. The Mazdaznin and they saw that spirit and matter were fighting against each other, and that woman represented matter and evil, which is a very personalized outlook of it. It can be a personalized outlook of it, and I try to shy away from that without. You can look into some of the conceptions that they had, and they developed some lovely conceptions in that outlook. But unless there is a very open-minded and non-prejudiced spirit that the material is looked at, it's very treacherous. Okay, thank you very much.